Hi, everybody. I'm Shelly, and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video, and today's topic is the mud flood and our hidden history. And I know this is something that I have talked about pretty extensively on this channel, although it's been a while since I really addressed this specific topic. But I have had a few people recently who are new to my channel asking me what the mud flood is. So I thought that it was about time that I do another video about the mud flood, which hopefully will give an overview of what we're talking about when we mention it. I also think that it's important to bring it up and to remind people about this or to introduce it to people because you cannot understand history if you do not understand the extent to which we have been lied to. And this includes biblical history, and this also includes prophecy. You cannot properly interpret prophecy if you do not take into account our hidden past. That's why I think that it's so important that we talk about this. I got several really good books for Christmas, and one of them that I received from one of my daughters is The Secret History of Human Resets by Donnie Davis. And so I'll leave a link in the description box for this if you are interested in taking a peek at it. But I'm going to read to you just a little summary from the very first section on the mud flood. This is from the section, The Mud Flood. What is the mud flood theory? What is the evidence? What if the history you are taught in textbooks is a lie? What if real history has been hidden from us? The mud flood theory proposes that humanity had an advanced civilization as little as 200 years ago. It suffered a catastrophic flood worldwide in the 1800s, which covered cities with a layer of mud between 6 to 12 feet deep. Afterwards, there was a systematic cover up that this event occurred, and our civilization was reset to a more primitive culture with forgotten knowledge. Evidence of a worldwide mud flood might be found in old historic buildings in which windows or doors are below ground level, or in old photographs showing streets caked in mud. Adherents of the mud flood theory believe this mud flood was accompanied by a depopulation event. Historic photographs seem to show fully built but empty cities. Perhaps a previous civilization built our cities, then suffered a cataclysm in which a large percentage of people perished. The elite may have systematically covered up this mud flood and encouraged people to repopulate the earth in the 1880s. People who were in on it taught the new population a false historical narrative in orphanages, boarding schools, and workhouses for children. And I'm also going to ask that they also used World's Fairs as what we can call re-education centers and even our public education system. It can be really hard for us, and this is just me speaking now, this isn't the book anymore. It can be really hard for us to admit that the history that we've been taught was wrong, especially when for the longest time I thought to myself that it's only the history that's being taught now that is incorrect. And I was always talking about revisionist history and how they've changed it, and how in the 1980s the textbooks started to change and they started teaching us things that weren't true. But I'm realizing now that that wasn't true either. The what's being taught in schools now may be even more out there and more convoluted, but I'm convinced that the history that we have been taught, even those of us who are closer to my age or even people who are older than me, because I'm 49 years old, they we didn't learn the real truth either. Real truth. Yeah, okay. So, what happened? What could have caused this mud flood? This event that caused this massive amount of mud and dirt to just pile up and to cover buildings and, well, I'm going to say that people were probably buried too. What could it have been? There are many theories about this. A lot of people will talk about plasma events. There is a lot of talk about an earthquake and the soil liquefaction that happens afterwards. Some people even believe that it could possibly have been from Noah's flood. And those of you who are new to this are probably thinking, what are they talking about? The biblical flood? That was thousands of years ago. Well, one of the other things that you will learn about if you continue on in the truther movement is that our timeline has very likely been I'll just say messed with. And there seems to be some evidence that a period of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years has been added to our history, which would make the biblical flood, if not a lot closer, it's closer than what we believe. And in fact, if that has been changed on our timeline, we don't really know what happened when, because this goes so deep. So let's just take a look at some photographic evidence of some sort of mud flood event that happened. And I also have to say that this is something that we don't even know, not only what it was, but who caused it. I'm starting to believe that it's very possible that those who a lot of us call the controllers nowadays may have somehow been able to cause it. It could have also been, I believe, from a biblical earthquake. But we do know that as of right now, they're doing a lot of stuff underground and it is causing earthquakes. And we know that a lot of things are happening with CERN that is causing earthquakes and other events. So why wouldn't it be able to happen then, especially when you realize that what the technology of the time was far more advanced than what they tell us. So as you can see, this photograph is from the 19th century, and if you look at these beautiful buildings, they certainly look like they belong in Europe. And so what we're told about the 19th century is that these people, they drove around in horse and carts, and they had steam technology at some point. But, a lot of times we'll be shown pictures of these people living in wooden shacks, and we think of Little House on the Prairie when they're living in their log cabins, or the Wild West with these saloons built out of wood. But in fact, what we see are buildings that look like this. And incidentally, many of these buildings will have these windows that seem not to fit. It's almost as if these buildings have been partially buried and dug out, just as what it looks like is happening here. It looks like these buildings have had some sort of mud event, some sort of mudslide maybe, and are now being dug out. And this is something that you will see all over the world. Much of what I'm going to be focusing on today is just in the United States, because I live in the United States and because it would be so hard to get all of the evidence together worldwide. But there are a lot of people who do cover other areas of the world. The Autodidactic channel, he covers Australia quite a bit and other things. So I would recommend his channel as well. But here's another photograph. So we have what looks to be these mud streets. But then they have these sidewalks here. And again, you've got these buried buildings. And I call them buried because we see these windows that are underground. You can still see it even behind this sidewalk here. And it seems to fly in the face of architecture to be building full-length windows underground, especially if you think about just mold and dampness getting in there, and the fact that there's really no reason to have doors and windows underground if it's, well, underground. This is obviously not a photograph. This is just an illustration, but it's just to illustrate the possibilities of what actually could be lying underneath some of these buildings. And as you will see, as we're looking at some of these buildings, they definitely look like they were cut off at an odd area. If you look here at the ground level here, you can almost tell that there should be something more to this building just because of the way the proportions are. And in fact, again, I know this is an illustration, but there are more things underneath. One thing that I always think about is that other parts of the world, and I've mentioned this before, other parts of the world, when things are excavated, things that are found underground, buildings that are found underground civilizations, they will give us certain stories. When it comes to, for example, in ancient Egypt, and we find things that are buried under the sand, oh, it's just through the passage of time. That's what has caused that. And then in Europe, when we find these civilizations, these towns underground, we'll hear various things of, yes, there were other civilizations that were here. They built on top of them. Some of them may have been buried by volcanic eruptions. Some of them may have, again, through the passage of time, people have just built civilization over civilization over civilization on top of them. But they will always admit that there were older civilizations in other parts of the world. But when it comes to well, I won't even just say the United States, I will say America and Australia. And by America, I mean North America and Australia, at least. They will never come out and say that there was an older civilization here. They will always give you some other reason. Instead of saying, oh, yes, well, it's very possible that there were other civilizations and we built on top of them. No, what we will usually hear is, oh, no, those buildings were just built like that. They were letting light into the basement. How much light is getting in to the basement through this window right here? That's my question. I was looking at some photos on Wikimedia Commons today, trying to find just some photographs from the 19th century that show some of this mud, these piles of mud that we see in so many other photographs, because I feel like I show the same ones over and over again. I'm trying to get new ones. It's really hard to find them because they are so buried. What I find very interesting, though, is that here we have a photograph from 2001, and it shows what happened during a mudslide. And this all went into the doorway of this house. Okay, this is the doorway. Here's a light here. And the mud went inside the house and destroyed it. And so people are always so quick to report things like this. This is from 2013, I believe. And they are digging out another house that was victimized by a mud flood, or not a mud flood, a mudslide. And so they will admit to things like this, and you will see people digging these houses out of the ground. Yet, when it comes to these buildings, oh no, they were built like that. Or we will get some other convoluted theory telling us that, well, they raised the sidewalks and that's why these buildings are looking like this. That's why they have these half buried windows on these beautiful grand structures that seem to look like the people of that time would never have been able to build them. The sidewalks were raised. And it's frustrating because for some reason the United States is not, and Australia again, and Canada are not allowed to have their own history. They're always known as, the new worlds, but there's a lot about them that is not new. It's just hidden. One more thing that I do want to add about these dirt roads that you will see everywhere, these mud-filled streets, these dirt roads, you've got these beautiful grand buildings, all right? You have these half-buried windows, and people say, oh, well, it was probably easier on the horse's hooves to be walking around on the dirt roads like that. But let's think about this. Imagine what these dirt roads looked like when it rained. That would have been nothing but mud. Can you imagine the horses dragging those carts through the mud? Not to mention these beautiful buildings here, they had to haul the materials there in order to build these buildings. Imagine hauling the materials there through the mud. It doesn't make sense. So what we're supposed to believe is that people of the 19th century who really didn't have much technology, at least, in comparison to what we have now, were able to build these beautiful grand buildings. But for some reason, they decided that they were going to either put windows half underground to let light in without having to worry about mold or anything like that, or they're going to either raise the sidewalks, and in some cases you will hear that they actually raised the buildings and raised the entire cities, because that would have been so easy to do that. Here's another example of an entrance that, well, it was buried. And it certainly looks here like these could have been bricked off windows. More examples. So we have a window here. And if you look, it's right below the other window. It will have this arched top. And a lot of these buildings will have the same sort of architecture. They will have the red bricks. They will have the arches above the windows and very often above the doorways. And again, the doorways even seem like they were much bigger than they needed to be. And yeah, you can say, well, this part is decorative and that's the door, so it's really not that big. But I have to think, could it have been possible that the whole thing at one time was the door? Look at the size of the window. But anyway, so we have that here, and then we have another door underneath here. So you have to wonder, was this the original entrance to this building? But something happened, whether it was dug out or, yeah, maybe they actually did raise the sidewalks. Again, that doesn't make sense to me, because you would have to think, if they would raise the sidewalks, wouldn't that make the homeowners pretty mad that, 6 to 12 feet of their houses were being buried by a sidewalk? Here's an example. This was once a window, and you can actually, underneath this grate here, you can see the rest of the window. So, that kind of defeats the argument that these were built to let in light, because you wouldn't need a light underground to let light into a basement, because you're not going to get light in this part of the window. The reason that that is a window is because this was once the first level of the house, at the very least. Now, this is obviously more modern, and this looks like it was from a mudslide as well, but it's obvious that these things do happen. But again, for some reason, the fact that something like this happened in the United States completely covered up. It was our forefathers built all of these beautiful buildings, and that's all that we're told, and we're not supposed to question it. We're not supposed to question why none of this is making sense. If you do it, you're un-American, right? To me, it's un-American to even say, oh, you know what, I'm just going to believe whatever they tell us. I think that if we love our country, we should want to know the truth about it. What actually did happen here? Who actually did build these buildings? And what is our real history? Right here, you can see evidence. Certainly looks like lots and lots of mud here. We've got an extremely muddy street, and you have to wonder, was this part of a cleanup effort? I don't know if this photograph specifically was, but it certainly does seem that these buildings that were covered by some sort of catastrophe, they were dug out, and they were founded by what we like to call the inheritors. These people inherited these buildings, kind of took them as their own, took credit for them, and that's how this country was established. It was established on free masonry, right? It was free. They found it, right? Founded on Freemasonry. Just some more evidence of this. And a lot of times you will find buildings that seem to extend below ground, but at the same time, sometimes you will find areas where it seems like it was an entirely different civilization, not even the same building, that was half buried, but that there was something else, some other group of people there that were completely underneath, and these buildings were then built on top of them. So in this photograph here, I believe the sidewalk was removed from this level here, and what you found underneath here was a whole other level. And again, why would you need to have doors underneath a sidewalk? Now, one other thing that I wanted to say is that there are other people who will say, well, those windows that you see, those are coal chutes. And I know what a coal chute is. I had a coal chute in one of the houses that I used to live in, and I agree that it can look like a little window to some, but it's very obviously a coal chute to most people, especially because it's much smaller than what an actual window would be. This one I found very interesting because you've got this entrance, it looks like underneath this set of stairs, and then you have these two windows here. And then this is the one that is said to be the coal chute. So it's not saying the windows are the coal chute. It's this. This is a coal chute cover, and that's where the coal would go in there. And yes, some houses that are more recently built do have basement windows, and they have what they call window wells around them to keep moisture from getting in them. So I said to someone the other day, I don't know if they saw these buildings with half, buried windows and were inspired by them. Oh, that would be a good way to let the light in, or if they actually thought that they were really for letting the light in. But at the very least, you can tell when they were specifically made to let light in, because they either will end above the ground or they will have a well around them. And these are some photographs that I took myself. These are in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on the Moravian College campus. This is a door up here. These are steps. And then underneath this door here, this door, is another door under the steps. And on this building, there are lots of windows that could definitely qualify as mud flood windows. So this is a different view of that building, but the door, there is a door, yes, right underneath here, and it is on the same level as these other windows. And if I would have gone up here, you would have seen that some of the other windows were more covered by the ground. Kind of see the window there too. More photos from the same campus. This is one of those instances where, remember, I was telling you that sometimes the building will seem like they just don't make sense where they are cut off at. They don't seem proportional. This is one of them. It very clearly looks like this part of the building should be much longer when you look at the size of the roof and the shape of the roof. And so certainly what you can see is that these windows, they're underground. And, it would certainly make sense that this should have been extended farther down. And that's just another view of that. It's just a summary of this picture right here. So let's see what that one says. Okay, July 9th, 2001. A wall of mud raged down the hill in Glen Ferris yesterday into this home and others. The mud-filled rooms and ruined countless household belongings during Sunday's. Oh, the mud-filled rooms. I was looking at it as an adjective. The mud-filled rooms and ruined countless household belongings during Sunday's severe rainstorm. So again, they're willing to admit that these things happen in more modern times. But now when you try to say that these buildings look like they were dug out, oh no, definitely not. That's ludicrous, right? Back to some more photos that I took. I I think this might have actually been in Allentown, Pennsylvania, but you see much of the same thing of these underground entrances. And then right here, you can see that there is a window here too. And then you have this entrance under here, and it doesn't seem to make sense the way that it was built. Now, could I be wrong? Absolutely. But I don't think that I'm wrong in every single circumstance. I have more of those. Lots of these windows in Allentown too. Downtown, I've noticed that in downtown areas is where you really see these things the most. This is in the town that I live in. It's the municipal building, and I've talked about this in some of my videos where I, went over my area, but we've got these bricked up windows. This is at the side of the building. This is the front, so these are behind some hedges. And so what you're looking at now is the municipal building. And then you see this is now the main entrance. And this is now considered the first floor. But I'm wondering if underneath these stairs, if you would actually get to behind those stairs, was there another door there? And was this the original first floor of this building too? Because there is a lot of mud flood evidence in my own town. This is a church by my house. This church was, I believe, built in 1900, it's claimed. And I'm wondering if instead of built, it was founded. I think here, besides my fingers, I was just trying to show how lopsided the doors are. I think you can see it better on the next one, but yeah. So here you do see these very large doorways. Again, yes, this top part can be decorative, but if you look at it compared to the size of the other windows, I do wonder if at one point it was an entire door. But you also see that the doorways, the bottoms of them are not even. We've got these windows here, and I don't remember if there were windows over here on this side too. I don't think there were. This one is one of my favorite photos from my area because this actually shows this is a window. I wish I would have gotten the whole window and just backed up a little bit. This is a whole window on a red brick building, and the glass is right flush with the sidewalk. And I'm sorry, no, that was not built like that on purpose to let in light. This is also a building where the entire entrance is, you have to go down several steps to get there. So in some of these buildings that were built underground, a lot of people will say, well, maybe they were built like that on purpose. And in some cases, that might be the case. But when you look at the houses that have entire doors underground and entire windows, it wouldn't work. In fact, on one of my videos, when I talked about this, someone who does plumbing said that flies in the face of how plumbing is done. Underground sewer lines were first used in the United States in the 1850s, and many of these buildings were said to have been built after that. So you have to consider that at least some of these buildings may have had plumbing in them, but what you actually find is that it wouldn't seem to work with how far some of these windows and doors are, and hence how far some of these lines would have had to have been if they were completely underground like that. Because it says here, most communities in Carbon County and throughout Pennsylvania require sewer lines to be installed well below the frost line. This means installing it at least 4 feet below grade. So the sewer lines have to be at least 4 feet below grade. But you can't really have sewer lines, at least not easily, above a toilet. So here, can a toilet be lower than the sewer line? To get the waste out from below the sewer line, you need a macerator installed behind the toilet to chew up the waste and pump it up to the house's drain. To make that work, you also need an electrical outlet close by to power the macerator. This is more than just straight plumbing. And this is now. And you need an electrical outlet to even do that. And it's, well, let's see. Electricity first started being used in the United States in the 1880s. So I don't know. I don't know if these people were using macerators. And I know that a lot of houses at that point may have had outhouses. The house that I grew up in was built in the early 1800s. And when my parents first moved in the 50s, it did have an outhouse. And my dad had to build the bathroom into it. But some of these buildings, especially in more of these populated areas, they would have had some sort of plumbing, I'm assuming. And according to the plumber who did comment, I wish I would have taken a screenshot of that, but that was actually a few years ago. It wouldn't have worked. So then if you even go beyond that, beyond all these photographs that I've been showing you of what we might call these mud flood windows and these huge piles of mud everywhere and these dirt roads, we also have all of these underground cities and towns. And I did a video on this before, so I'm not going to go too extensively into it, but I will show you some examples. So here we have underground Eureka Springs. And the stories for these underground cities are always very, very similar. Just as if you look up the architecture and the building history of a lot of well-known buildings, you will have very, very similar stories. It's as if the controllers, I still call them that, those who think they're in control, they are using some sort of template to write their historical narratives. Maybe it's just to make things easier. I don't know. But you'll see when I read them. The history of underground Eureka. According to local history, 2 major streets in downtown Eureka Springs underwent considerable re-engineering in the year 1890. Another thing that you will see, 1890 seems to be a very important year in this narrative. And I've talked about 1890 before, but some events that happened in or around 1890 are the 1890 census record fire, where all the census records of 1890 were lost. It was around that time, I believe in 1889, when Ellis Island caught fire. So all of the immigration records were also lost in a fire around this time. And what you will see in in many of these buildings that you're looking at that are half buried like this, you'll see that they were founded in 1890, 1890, 1890. You just start paying attention to histories and see how many times you come up with the year 1890. I'm telling you, it's very interesting. So anyway, Main Street was the first official street in town, built in a low-level gulch alongside a small spring-fed creek. It suffered from frequent runoff problems and quickly earned the nickname Mud Street, hence the need for improvements. The second street in town requiring attention was Spring Street, as it was also becoming a main thoroughfare for carriage traffic. Today, it serves as the primary route for much of Eureka's historic loop. These significant road improvements reportedly raised the overall level of the two streets and required that a number of businesses along Spring Street and Main Street create new entrances on the second floor. That sounds familiar. It looks like many of the buildings that I just showed you. Yet if you actually look at the history of those cities, it says nothing about anything being raised. Anyway, thereby making basements out of the once level street facades. Well, that's pretty funny. These original entrance levels were walled off and now lie hidden within a string of disconnected subterranean limestone tunnels. Over the years, these mysterious and somewhat dangerous passageways have become known as underground Eureka. Let's see. I believe we can read a little bit. Let me see. Trying to find the history of it. I did see it somewhere. Okay, here we go. And here is where you're really going to see that some of these narratives start repeating. The not so novel underground. These underground cities, as they are sometimes called, are actually quite common. Urban areas that suffered from frequent fires, one that you're going to hear a lot, mudslides, and flooding, another one that you're going to hear a lot, quickly learned the benefit of heading for higher ground. Rather than relocating and starting over, it usually made more sense to build a city up higher, leaving a web of sub-basement levels and underground foundation corridors. Imagine being the homeowner or the business owner who then had to pay for this. In some cases, systems of tunnels were developed for utilities and transportation, then later abandoned. Other tunnels have a darker past, consisting of human trafficking, I'm sure that's what many of them are still being used for, red light districts, and prohibition. Although it is usually quite complicated and expensive, opening some of these underground areas to the public isn't an earth-shattering idea. Cities across the plain have offered outsiders a chance to explore their subterranean secrets with great success and profit for years. And then it's just going to talk about some other of these underground cities. One of which is the Seattle Underground, which I've talked about before, but the history of it is intriguing enough that I'm just going to include it here because, again, you're going to see a lot of the same narratives. Oh, and look here, we've got 1889. Remember I said on or around 1890? Yes, it's always in there. So anyway, Seattle Underground. The Seattle Underground is a network of underground passageways and basements in the Pioneer Square neighborhood of Seattle, Washington, United States. They were located at ground level when the city was built in the mid-19th century, but fell into disuse after the streets were elevated. So again, we've got this whole idea, nope, these buildings weren't buried. These streets were elevated. Buildings can be buried now, by mudslides, and they can be buried over in Africa and Europe. But in America, nope, everything's brand new. So let's just say that the streets were elevated. Okay, let's go with that. In recent decades, they have become a tourist attraction. So the history. At approximately 2:20 p.m. on June 6, 1889, an accidentally overturned glue pot in a carpentry shop started the most destructive fire in the history of Seattle. I highly encourage you to go to my video about the Great Fires that I made several years ago, because you could go to pretty much any major city in the United States, Canada, it even happened in Europe, and type in Great Fire and some sort of great fire will have happened. all usually around the same time in history, and they all have some stupid story for how the fire started, like this overturned glue pot in a carpentry shop. Most people know the story of the Great Chicago Fire, where supposedly it was started by a cow. Yeah, I was going to say you can't make this stuff up, but I actually think they did. So, after this Great Seattle Fire, new construction was required to be of masonry, and the town streets were regraded 1 to 2 stories higher. Pioneer Square had originally been built mostly on filled-in tidelands and often flooded. This is another thing that you will find. For example, in Chicago, for the Chicago World's Fair, that would be the Columbian Exposition of 1893, that was said to have been built on swampland. So again, tidelands, swamplands, marshes, another narrative that you're going to see in many of these histories. So now we've got fires, we've got floods, we've got elevated streets, or in some cases, elevated buildings. Yes, because they even claimed to elevate entire buildings on jacks. And in some cases, they said that people were still shopping in stores while they were doing it. Like they were actually in the buildings that were being elevated. Oh, ridiculous. But anyway, and often flooded. The new street level also kept sewers draining into Elliott Bay from backing up at high tide. For the regrade, the streets were lined with concrete walls that formed narrow alleyways between the walls and the buildings on both sides of the street, with a wide alley where the street was. The naturally steep hillsides were used, and through a series of sluices, material was washed into the wide alleys by raising the streets to the desired new level, generally 12 feet higher than before, in some places nearly 30 feet. I just want to go back, and one thing that I wanted to say was that it says that the new construction was required to be of masonry after the fire, and that's when they moved the sidewalks up. But if you actually look at pictures of the Seattle Underground, they were already made of brick. So that narrative gets destroyed just by looking at the buildings that are in the Seattle Underground. They were brick. Now, this is another part that I find pretty astonishing, to say the least, and yeah, a bit hard to believe. At first, pedestrians climbed ladders to go between street level and the sidewalks in front of the building entrances. Imagine being a pedestrian and having to climb a ladder 12 feet. The women wearing those long dresses in that time, they were climbing ladders 12 feet to go between street level and the sidewalks. Imagine how many accidents happened in that time. How many falls? I guess they were invincible and really athletic. Brick archways were constructed next to the road surface above the submerged sidewalks. Vault lights, a form of walk-on skylight with small panes of clear glass, which later became amethyst colored, were installed over the gap from the raised street and the building, creating the area now called the Seattle Underground. When they reconstructed their buildings, merchants and landlords knew that the ground floor would eventually be underground, and the next floor up would be the new ground floor. So there is very little decoration on the doors and windows of the original ground floor, or is it possibly because whoever found these buildings took it away, but extensive decoration on the new ground floor. Yes, because they were redecorating. Once the new sidewalks were complete, building owners moved their businesses to the new ground floor. Although merchants carried on business in the lowest floors of buildings that survived the fire, and pedestrians continued to use the underground sidewalks lit by the vault lights embedded in the great grade level vaulted sidewalk above. In 1907, the city condemned the underground for fear of bubonic plague, and the basements were left to deteriorate or were used as storage. So, yes, the Seattle Underground is a perfect example of how these templates were used. So as I was just searching around on DuckDuckGo, trying to find some more of these underground cities that I hadn't talked about yet, I found this one, which I had never heard of, and it says the abandoned underground city in Ellenwood, Kansas is a must visit. It's the late 1800s in Ellenwood, Kansas. Again, late 1800s, dare I say maybe around 1890. A town German immigrants call home. Sitting in the center of Kansas on the Santa Fe Trail, teamsters and cowboys pass through, stopping in for banking, the barber, a bath, and perhaps the brothel. As sometimes happened in towns with German Austrian roots, Ellenwood was built on 2 levels. You don't say. As a result, the town's residents functioned in the street level businesses while the transients took their business underground. From 1887, that's awfully close to 1890, isn't it? To about 1920, a whole community existed underneath Ellenwood's sidewalks, a labyrinth of tunnels and businesses primarily for men. In today's terms, it was the ultimate man cave. Oh, brother. As the railroads took over, jobs for cowboys and teamsters declined, and underground Ellenwood became less active. Adriana Deerolf rediscovered the abandoned underground city in 1979 when she inherited some of the downtown buildings. Eventually, the town decided to fill in some of the tunnels and many of the rooms. Today, you can explore what's remaining of this abandoned underground city on the Ellenwood Underground Tour. Sorry, I'm just laughing because I'm still going back to where it says that, as sometimes happened in towns with German Austrian roots, Ellenwood was built on 2 levels. Of course it was, because that lower level was definitely not there before. Yeah, and I know you'll have to forgive my sarcasm as I read through these. It's just that the more that I read these stories, the more irritated I get because these stories are completely ludicrous. Yet when we question them, we are looked at as the crazy ones. When in fact, the evidence is obvious and it's just all around us. So the last thing that I want to go over with you that is related to the mud flood, simply because it is an attempt to explain away these buildings and these entire towns that were below ground level. Let's just take a look at the supposed raising of Chicago. I hope you can still hear me because my mic is getting caught in my chair. But anyway, during the 1850s and 1860s, engineers carried out a piecemeal raising of the grade of central Chicago to lift the city out of its low-lying swampy ground. So there's that swamp again. Buildings and sidewalks were physically raised on jack screws. The work was funded by private property owners and public funds. I highly encourage you to look into the history of Chicago. It is filled with so many questions, just regarding, even if you're just looking at the Great Chicago Fire and what supposedly started it and the extent of the destruction, how quickly it was rebuilt, and then how, while it was still being rebuilt, they somehow were able to make, I think it was 690 acres, and to devote that to the Columbian Exposition, which was the World's Fair of 1893. Insane. But anyway, during the 19th century, the elevation of the Chicago area was little higher than the shoreline of Lake Michigan. For 2 decades following the city's incorporation, drainage from the city's surface was inadequate, resulting in large bodies of standing and pathogenic water. These conditions caused numerous epidemics, including typhoid fever and dysentery, which blighted Chicago 6 years in a row, culminating in the 1854 outbreak of cholera that killed 6% of the city's population. The crisis forced the city's engineers and aldermen to take the drainage problem seriously, and after many heated discussions and following at least one false start, a solution eventually materialized. And so, suffice it to say, that was the raising of the buildings. But it says here, many of the city's old wooden buildings were considered not worth raising. So instead, the owners of these wooden buildings had them either demolished or else placed on rollers and moved to the outskirts of Chicago. Business activities in such buildings continued as they were being moved. So this here talks about the earliest raising of a building. But what I'm actually going to talk to you about is this one. Okay. I'll leave a link if you want to read through all of them. But this is the one that really gets me. The row on Lake Street. And here is an illustration of what they say is the raising of a whole block on Row Street. Oh, and what do you notice here? Well, look at that. There were still people walking around and shopping while they're raising these buildings. All right. In 1860, a consortium of no fewer than 6 engineers co-managed a project to raise half a city block on Lake Street between Clark Street and LaSalle Street completely and in one go. This was a solid masonry row of shops, offices, printeries. It had a footprint taking up almost 1 acre of space and an estimated total weight, including hanging sidewalks, of 35,000 tons. Businesses operating in these premises were not closed down during the operation. As the buildings were being raised, people came, went, shopped, and worked in them as they would ordinarily do. In 5 days, the entire assembly was elevated 4 feet 8 inches by a team consisting of 600 men using 6,000 jack screws. Oh, okay. Which made it ready for new foundation walls to be built underneath. The spectacle drew crowds of thousands who were, on the final day, permitted to walk at the old ground level among the jacks. I wonder where they got all these jacks from, these jack screws. Anyway, just another story that if you're going to read Wikipedia and you're just going to kind of take what it says at face value, okay, you can do that if you want. But if you're going to be someone who actually looks at it and thinks about it and thinks, where did these things come from? How could this be possible? And why do all of these stories sound so similar? Then I think that you and I could have a good conversation. But anyway, that's all that I have for you today. I hope that it explained a little bit of what we mean by mud flood. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or over on Instagram. And if you like my work and would like to check out my YouTube membership, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.